Okay, good evening everybody and welcome to John Cabot University. Before I begin, let me say that this event will be recorded, so just for information for anybody who has any concerns about privacy or anything, this is going to be recorded. It is a distinct honor and a pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker, the Honorable Special Representative of the UN Secretary General for Children in Armed Conflict, Ms. Virginia Gamba, the Pot-Getter. Welcome.
Thank you.
And all the other distinguished panelists to this important conference on the mandate of the United Nations Special Representative of the Secretary General and the plight of children in armed conflicts. An important role established 25 years ago by the General Assembly of the United Nations. Our children are our future and our hope, but at the same time, they are those who are most defenseless in times of wars and violence. The extent to which we can protect them gives a measure of who we are as a civilized society and as human beings. In the book, The Wisdom of the Fathers, it says, "The world stands on the breath of the children who go to school. If that breath stops, the world cannot stand." This is why it is so important to do all we can to protect children in areas of conflict. And we at John Cabot University, thanks also to the dedication of Professor Silvia Scarpa, and in collaboration with the Università San Pio V and the university networks, which has promoted this event, take special pride in our support of these initiatives aimed at ensuring the safety of children in areas of conflict, which so well captures the spirit of our university mission. I'm now pleased to introduce tonight's distinguished keynote speaker, Professor Virginia Gamba, the Pot-Getter, who was named Special Representative on Children in Armed Conflicts in April 2017 by Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Born in Argentina, Ms. Gamba holds degrees from the University of Wales, Aberystwyth, and the University of Newcastle, and has a rich history of service in the fields of disarmament and conflict resolution, serving, among others, as Assistant Secretary General, Head of the Joint Investigative Mechanism Syria, and Deputy to the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs and Director of the Office for Disarmament Affairs. From 1996 to 2006, Ms. Gamba was based in Africa, serving inter alia as Deputy Director of the Institute for Security Studies in South Africa and Director for South-South Interactions for a Safer Africa. She has also served as Senior Lecturer at the Latin American Security Studies Department of War Studies at King's College in London from 1986 to 1991. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming tonight's keynote speaker, Special Representative Virginia Gamba, the Pot-Getter. Thank you very much.
I cannot tell you how happy I am to be. Is it good? Yeah, I've already pressed. To be here because for 2 years I've been trying to get here, but like everybody else in this room, we were stuck in a room somewhere in a different country talking to a computer. So I'm just so happy to be here at last. So I just want to start by thanking Professor Pavoncello, really, Laura, Fausto, Mark, Silvia, Paolo, all the ones that are going to join me, you know, hopefully interactively with all of you after this little speech, which I owe you. because I think it's important that you understand where we come from, where I come from, what we do. And hopefully we can find ways in which you can help towards this quite beautiful task. It really is an honor for me to have been invited to speak. First and foremost, I would really like to thank the John Cabot University, the Istituto San Pio V, and the Universities Network for Children in Armed Conflict for the organization of this event. I would also like to thank all of you for taking time and hopefully to interact with us tonight. My name, you've heard me, is Virginia Gamba. The rest of the name is my husband's, but that's fine. And I am the current and fourth special representative of the United Nations Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict. A long time ago, I was a senior lecturer in Latin American Security Studies in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. And an even longer time ago, I was myself a student, as was said here, at the University College of Aberystwyth in Wales, completing my Magister in Strategic Studies. An old professor from that college taught me a very important lesson. He told me to see the world as it is and not as I would wish it to be, but to fight depression because hope always defeats experience. Tonight, let us follow his advice and see the world for what it is, but let us do it in hope that we can change what must be changed. In my current role, one thing I try is to change very much the approach we take to conflict-affected children in an attempt to try to lessen their suffering, and when we cannot, to prevent the suffering of other children if we fail at our task. Indeed, among those who live through conflict, children are the most vulnerable. 25 years ago, Graça Machel, a former Minister of Education of Mozambique, published a groundbreaking report titled The Impact of Armed Conflict on Children. And she concluded that children are disproportionately affected by the horrors of conflict, and they are their primary victims. The report led, as was said, to the adoption of Resolution 5177 by the UN General Assembly, which created the mandate that I am representing here. The resolution recommended that the Secretary General appoint a special representative for children and armed conflict to keep this issue high on the international agenda. Since then, my office has been actively advocating for child protection in conflict-affected situations. Our goal is to deliver concrete change for children on the ground, raise awareness, promote the collection of information about the plight of children affected by war, and foster international cooperation to improve their protection. However, since 1999, barely a few, 3-4 years after we were created, the United Nations Security Council also endorsed the agenda. I always say they hijacked us as a matter of international peace and security. 6 grave violations against children that are considered particularly egregious have been identified by the Security Council, and we have been ordered to engage in these 6 violations. And these are the recruitment and use of children in conflict, and it is possibly this first violation that is the best known. Children are used in many different functions in conflict, including as soldiers, spies, cooks, porters, sex slaves, lookouts, and so on. The other violations that now are part of my docket over the years, they did not come all at once, include the killing and maiming of children and sexual violence against children, which were a result of a different Security Council resolution in the year 1999. We also have been tasked to look at the abduction of children during war and armed conflict, the denial of humanitarian access to children in those situations, and of course, attacks on schools and hospitals. Each of these violations results in really unspeakable suffering for children with long-term consequences and leaving many scars, both physical and psychological, and I would add developmental, that really remain with them for a lifetime. To end and to prevent those 6 grave violations, the Security Council has asked the United Nations Secretary General to report annually via my office and with the collaboration of our United Nations partners on the ground. We then collaborate on those violations in conflict-affected countries to monitor, report, and eventually list. List means providing attribution of guilt to parties to conflict. This year's annual report of the Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflict has once again highlighted the devastating scale of violations affecting children caught in armed conflict worldwide. So I'll give you a few figures. To give you an idea, in 2021, remember we always report verified information of the year that was. For this year's figures, you have to wait until we publish for 2023. So for the year 2021, as verified by United Nations officials in 25 situations of conflict worldwide, we were able to see and verify 23,982 grave violations against children. This number is, however, we know it, only the tip of the iceberg. These are the visible children. They are not the invisible ones. In many situations, the United Nations does not have access to all the territory to verify information. And many times, even if they have access, they arrive a little bit too late, and many survivors, for fear of stigma or retaliation, do not come forth to be verified. Situations of last year with the highest quantity of children affected were first and foremost the Democratic Republic of the Congo, then Somalia, then Yemen, Israel, the occupied Palestinian territory, Afghanistan, Central African Republic, and Syria. As in previous years, the killing and maiming of children was the leading violation with the greatest quantities for the year, with 8,000 victims of killing and maiming amongst children. And for us, children are 0 to 18 years old. Behind these numbers are the tragic stories of children. In Afghanistan, for instance, a child found a mortar grenade inside an irrigation canal in Kunduz province in February of last year. And he tried to sell it to a metal purchaser who was also a child. The grenade exploded, killing both and wounding 6 more. The number of children recruited and used by armed forces and groups also remained high. This was the second highest violation of last year, with over 6,300 children verified as having been recruited and used. This includes children's stories such as in Syria, for instance, where a teenage girl left for class yet never returned home. Her parents were later informed by the Patriotic Revolutionary Youth Movement that their daughter had been conscripted and that they should not attempt to reach her. Furthermore, over 3,900 cases of denial, both individual and collective, of humanitarian access to children were verified, and 872 incidents of attacks on schools and hospitals, which we call a collective violation. It can only be quantified on the number of children that were stopped from going to school because of this. At the same time, cases of abduction, although not so high in the quantifiable list, and cases of rape and sexual violence have been increasing in an exponential manner. And today, if you ask me what am I most worried about, is the fact that year upon year, for the last 3 years, we've seen an increase by over 20% per annum compared to previous years. So this clearly is soon going to be a top violation. The truth is that abduction is growing. In Burkina Faso, for instance, in February 2021, 2-year-old girls and an adult woman looking for firewood were abducted by 4 armed individuals. Because many violations are connected to other violations, the 2 children were raped, each by 2 of the armed men. These are only a few of the tragic stories of children affected by conflict, and they are very difficult to hear, but it is important not to ignore them, because statistics should never make us overlook the individual behind the number. Of all grave violations, 55%, this is really interesting, 55% last year were attributed as having been committed, verifiably, by armed groups, i.e. non-state actors, and 25% by state actors, while 15% of all violations remained unattributed, i.e. the perpetrator has been unidentified. Why? Mainly as a result of crossfire between parties to conflict, makes it very hard to attribute one side against the other, but fundamentally because we're seeing a real growth in children killed and maimed because of unexploded remnants of war, improvised mines, and improvised explosive devices. We thought we had controlled anti-personnel landmines with the Ottawa Convention. It seems that we are reversing. We are not implementing the terms of that convention. We're seeing more mines. We're seeing more explosive remnants of war left behind war. And we're seeing much more use of improvised explosive devices. We further need to bear in mind that, compounded by political, security, and climate emergencies, the repeated waves of the COVID-19 pandemic continue to increase children's vulnerability to grave violations. The push and pull factors pushing children to early marriage or to being recruited by armed groups is sometimes only explained through the impoverishment of communities as a direct result of the isolation and the measures put in place in 2020 because of COVID. While the situation is bleak, there are also signs of hope. Indeed, alongside the previously mentioned reporting and listing processes, the Security Council has also provided us with an increasingly robust framework of response and prevention mechanisms, with so-called, we call them, and they are Security Council resolutions with that name, UN Joint Action Plans. And these are at the center of what we call engaging parties to conflict to cease and desist on the violations for which they have been identified. So action plans are commitments that we persuade parties to conflict to sign with the United Nations to implement concrete and time-bound measures such as the release of child soldiers and putting in place age vetting exercises in recruitment offices. We also asked them to undertake laws, if they're a government, so that there would be updated child acts that would criminalize the 6 grave violations. But it is very difficult to implement this quickly. Years of constructive engagement with parties to conflict, both state and non-state, to protect children are really beginning to bear fruit today. Thanks to the work on the Children and Armed Conflict agenda by not just my office, but our partners from the United Nations country offices on the ground, over 180,000 children have been released since the year 2000, following the advocacy of the UN with parties to conflict and the development and implementation of action plans and other commitments. Last year alone, we were able to release 12,300 children. 20 of such action plans are currently under implementation, with the latest signed by myself with the Houthis in Yemen in April of this year. In addition, at least 40 new commitments were made by parties to conflict last year, such as command orders, roadmaps, or mitigation measures during military operations. In Mali, for instance, advances were made in the implementation of the Safe Schools Declaration and the revision of the bill on the protection of education from attack. In the Philippines, one of our, I think, greatest successes, the armed forces of the Philippines finally were convinced to sign, together with the United Nations, the first strategic plan to prevent and respond to grave child rights violations in situations of armed conflict in June last year. Most recently, in Burkina Faso and in Nigeria this year, we have convinced both parties to sign handover protocols for children encountered in military operations, and when they see these children, instead of putting them directly to detention or sometimes shooting, they actually take over and hand them to the civilian child protection actors as coordinated by UNICEF. Furthermore, we are nearing the universal ratification of the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child on the Involvement of Children in Armed Conflict. Progress has been achieved in terms of accountability for child recruitment through national and international justice mechanisms. More and more of these action plans are yielding an internal accountability process where anyone disobeying command orders is actually prosecuted by their own legislation. And member states around the world have now signed up on voluntary commitments to protect children in conflict, such as the Paris Principles and the commitments on children associated with armed forces or armed groups, the Safe Schools Declaration, and the Vancouver Principles on Peacekeeping and the Prevention of Recruitment and Use of Child Soldiers. These 3 commitments are signed by over 100 member states of the United Nations, and they are voluntary commitments, but they are beginning to really work. I was incredibly happy on Friday when I finally got the government of Colombia to agree to demilitarize their schools. So, dear students and colleagues, the Children and Armed Conflict Mandate is about accountability through monitoring and reporting on grave violations against children. And it is also about protecting conflict-affected children and preventing violations against them as possible, including through engaging with parties to conflict to convince them. This work cannot, however, be done by my office alone. It requires partnerships with a broad range of actors, and it requires human resources that are trained on child rights and child protection methods, such as lawyers, child protection advisors, doctors, psychologists, sociologists, judges, social workers, mediators, diplomats, facilitators of conflict resolution, government officials, staff of non-governmental organizations, academics, and journalists. This agenda is multidimensional, and research drawn from various disciplines is essential for a more comprehensive understanding of the challenges we are facing today. Universities have a significant role to play in that regard by developing adequate academic curricula and training professionals who work on children's rights, including in policy formulation, legal frameworks, child protection expertise in the field, and through the promotion of academic research to fill gaps of information. In this regard, I'm especially thankful to the university's Network for Children in Armed Conflict, of which the John Cabot University is a member, for giving special attention to the topic and sensitizing students to it. Having been a university professor myself, I deeply value the crucial role of academia in society. I thus also welcome this exchange with you here tonight. So in conclusion, to build unified and resilient societies and break the cycle of violence, we must invest in children and put them at the center of all our efforts, especially in conflict situations when they are so vulnerable. We also need to invest more in young generations and include them in our peace-building strategies. We must hear their voice. My advice to you all is that you must actively engage in order to shape today's and tomorrow's world. Every year, thousands of boys and girls are victims of one or more grave violations, and it is time to act to protect them. Together, we can and we will make a difference to better protect children from the devastating consequences of armed conflict. Lastly, we must never forget that the best way to protect children is through the building of peace. Peace is not a bad word, like many of us tend to think. It actually is a solution to all of this. Peace is the only way that we can meaningfully stop the use and abuse of children in, for, and by armed conflict. While you work to protect children from violence in conflict, do not forget to assist and support the negotiation for lasting peace. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Gamba, for such a very important and interesting keynote speech that summarizes, as you say, the problems and dark issues that we still have in our way forward for guaranteeing the protection of children in armed conflicts, but also the hope. And definitely we see your mandate and the work that you do every day as part of the hope that we have in bringing a solution to the issue of children in armed conflicts. I now would like to open the panel discussion, and we have distinguished experts and professors who will discuss with me the issue of how to guarantee the protection of children in armed conflicts, and also what is the role of the mandate in its 25th anniversary. It's such a special year for your mandate, and definitely it needs to be celebrated in the best way possible, because we all see the great efforts and the achievements that your mandate has been able to achieve. Let me first of all introduce Professor Mark Drumbl, who is connected remotely with us. And Professor Drumbl is the class of 75 alumni professor at Washington and Lee University School of Law, and he also serves as the director of the university's Transnational Law Institute. Professor Drumbl is well known at John Cabot University because he has been spending a couple of summers in Rome teaching a very interesting and important course on child soldiers here at John Cabot University. So many students here might know him personally because of that, and they have valued his work extensively. Professor Drumbl also published extensively in the area of children in armed conflicts and in particular on child soldiers. And we would like to remember his books edited with Justine Barrett, the Research Handbook on Child Soldiers, published with Edward Elgar in 2019, and the book that he published, Reimagining Child Soldiers in International Law and Policy with Oxford University Press in 2012. Professor Drumbl, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me all right?
Yes, we do.
Okay, good. That's wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Scarpa, for the opportunity to participate, to join in this conversation. As you indicated, which is what I was going to start with, I also think that universities have an important role in addressing concerns of violence against children in armed conflict through pedagogy and activism. And it has been a complete joy for me to be able to teach in this space at JCU for the past 2 summers, and also to be able to connect with such a vital and vivid group of academics at JCU, and also more generally in the Italian Legal Academy. So thank you for this opportunity. I'd also like to thank the special representative for her extremely informative comments to set the stage with regards to what lies before us in the realm of children in armed conflict. Special representative, I really appreciated your balance of optimism and accomplishment on the one hand, together then with the realities of ongoing challenges that lie in front of us. The office of which you are now the special representative is now operative since 1997, and I believe has done an incredible amount of awareness raising, effective on the ground work, and advocacy on this crucial issue. So 2 of the other commentators that I see on the list are quite eminently known in the space of international criminal law, and perhaps in their remarks would address the role of international courts and tribunals or national courts and tribunals within the framework of responding to and preventing the recruitment, use, and enlistments of children in armed conflict, and other of the 6 violations that the special representative indicated. And of course, I too am a lawyer and have my own views in that regard. But I think what I'd like to do in the 5 or 6 minutes that I have is move the conversation perhaps in a bit of a broader discursive frame, looking well beyond law and into broader challenges. For me, in my own experience, the first point I'd like to make is the most difficult aspect of the child soldiering phenomenon is the question of reintegration. The question of children returning to society and occupying durable, content, and future-oriented civilian roles. And to me, I think this is the one concern where the largest amount of effort still remains to be done. I was very heartened by the special representative's gestures towards the centrality of interdisciplinarity in this particular regard. For me, in my own work on the ground, what I have found is that some of the most effective reintegration mechanisms go well beyond education, counseling, and psychotherapy. They involve things like art therapy, drama therapy, reenactment, ceremonial rituals, and also the reality of the need for forms of economic stability in the lives of young people. So one point I would gesture towards is, to the extent that it falls within the mandate of the special representative, enhancing interdisciplinarity when it comes to reintegration is key. My second point relates to technology. Armed conflict increasingly and violences increasingly are not only waged in real time, they are also waged in virtual time. Many recordings exist now, notorious with ISIS, for example, of children engaged in acts of terrible violence, often at the coercion and compulsion of their leaders or commanders. And I think one thing that entire conception of how childhood is and how memory is recorded, and also what reintegration means, has to take into account virtual spaces, virtual recordings, not necessarily artificial realities, but virtual realities, many of which are very, very real to young people. And these kinds of intersections of not only reaching young people, but also recognizing places, entire domains in which violence occurs, are very important when we look beyond and into the future. The third of the 4 points that I would like to make in terms of future challenges lies and operates perhaps at the margins of the current mandate of the special representative, but I think are absolutely key. And that is the question, what is armed conflict? And what levels of violence does armed conflict actually cover? Is terrorism armed conflict? What about children enmeshed in criminal gangs, narco trafficking, sex trafficking, embedded dangerous labor practices, gangs, and so forth? I'm doing quite a bit of work in the area of analogizing armed groups with criminal syndicates and gangs, both of which are tremendously violent spaces, and both of which often acquire, adopt, and pursue similar methods of recruitment, enlistment, retention, and violence deploying. I think it's very important to recognize that mandates for children, not soldiers, key to the special representative's mandate, really only cover a small part of the violences that are often organized to which children are subject. And another future direction I would encourage is to really interrogate the meaning of armed conflict and recognize that increasingly violences that have very similar effects on the lives of children don't necessarily fit within traditional definitions of armed conflict. And that is in addition to the obscurities and ambiguities that already arise with the interface with technology, which was my previous point. And my last point, and on this I'll conclude, is the need to build a true culture of juvenile rights. One thing I have found in all my work with child soldiers is before conflict, children who end up soldiering are often at the very bottom of social hierarchies. And then what I have found is after conflict, those children remain at the bottom of the social hierarchies that exist post-conflict. And one of the reasons for this, I think, is that I am not certain that to date, the process and progress we have made in eradicating child soldiering has necessarily happened in conjunction with truly liberation theory and truly progressive conversations about what building a culture of juvenile rights actually means. And to me, this involves very important conversations of juvenile participation in society. I was very heartened recently to learn in New Zealand the unconstitutionality of the voting age of 18, this perhaps going down to the age of 16, addressing questions of statelessness that often unsettle children, addressing conversations of freedoms, and truly putting in place the main frame, I think, of the Children's Rights Convention, which is the evolving capacity of youth. And that's the note on which I would like to end. A forward-looking note of thinking creatively of reintegration, recognizing the centrality of technology, recognizing the amplitude of violences, and underscoring the key need to develop very rich cultures of juvenile rights across the board. Thank you very much for your time. I regret not being able to be in Rome. I love Rome, as I do, but it's better through tech now than not at all. Thank you.
Thanks very much to you, Professor Drumbl, for your illuminating speech and for having respected time, which is also important. I see the special representative taking a lot of notes, and I think this is very important because the 5 points that you have emphasized, I also agree with you that are very important. Let me proceed by now introducing Professor Paolo De Nardis, who is full professor of sociology at La Sapienza University here in Rome, and is the author of various publications in the field of sociological theory, relations between the social sciences, socialist thought, and political participation. Professor De Nardis is also the president of the Institute of Political Studies at San Pio V since 2017, and in that capacity he has been supporting also the network and many of the activities that we are conducting within the network. So thank you very much, Professor De Nardis, for that support, and the floor is yours.
Chiedo scusa, spongo in italiano perché sto scappando in un'altra online, però ci tenevo molto ad essere presente in questo importante meeting che chiude una 2 giorni particolarmente vivace e dinamica all'interno di quelle che sono le tappe fondamentali europee, da Lussemburgo a Roma. E volevo semplicemente ribadire quanto in qualche modo avevo cercato di spiegare ieri sera, collegato online con Lussemburgo, non soltanto sul ruolo che in qualche modo l'istituto che ha la ventura di presiedere, vale a dire l'Istituto San Pio V, di Studi Politici San Pio V di Roma, che mi auguro possa avere altre occasioni di incontro con la John Cabot, e qui ringraziamo tantissimo per la squisita ospitalità il suo presidente, il professor Pavoncello, veramente che è stato molto molto disponibile in questo incontro nel cuore poi della nostra città. E soprattutto per quello che riguarda tutta una revisione un po' delle categorie che noi stiamo effettuando nelle ricerche d'istituto, che hanno un po' una visione. Sono tante, in effetti. Noi lavoriamo su studi e ricerche, siamo quasi tutti professori universitari prestati un po' a questa ricerca, che è ricerca pubblica, sono finanziamenti pubblici, ma di un istituto privato. Dove in effetti si cerca, la visione è quella di capire se le categorie che fino ad oggi abbiamo analizzato per spiegare determinati fenomeni possono essere ancora valide. Lo dico volentieri qui in una sede sostanzialmente statunitense dal punto di vista di quello che è la mission anche culturale, perché gran parte di quelle categorie fanno parte di una cassetta degli attrezzi che per quanto ci riguarda vengono oltreoceano e che per anni hanno costituito il nostro pane quotidiano. Mi riferisco soprattutto allo struttural funzionalismo, che è una corrente di pensiero che unisce gran parte degli studiosi qui presenti. Abbiamo sentito la bella relazione di Virginia Gamba prima, così ricca, così succosamente presente e sentitamente portata avanti, secondo un impegno etico fondamentale che ispira tutto il network qui. E in questa situazione abbiamo capito che forse quelle categorie che hanno ben spiegato quella che poteva essere la situazione anche dell'infanzia violata dopo la tragedia del secolo scorso, che fu la Seconda Guerra Mondiale, e quindi dopo quella Berlino anno zero, ricordiamoci il bel film di Rossellini, dove l'infanzia veniva violata così platealmente e così ben rappresentato quello che era stata la tragedia di quel secolo, oggi di fronte alla tragedia dei bambini nei conflitti armati, evidentemente forse quelle categorie che riposavano su quella realtà sociale, anche forse dal punto di vista giuridico, non sono più adeguate. Non sono più adeguate perché anche le scienze biologiche, mediche, via discorrendo, non sono più quelle, e quindi la spiegazione in qualche modo va revisionata, rivisitata, rivista. Direi che nonostante il dottor Gugliotta qui presente, uno dei dirigenti delle colonne dell'Istituto, può ben in qualche modo entrare in questo coro in cui praticamente questa visione ci ha portato poi a questo punto d'approdo. Per noi il network rappresenta un punto d'approdo fondamentale, perché abbiamo in questa maniera potuto in qualche modo sperimentare anche non soltanto il network interorganizzativo, che noi abbiamo studiato in sociologia dell'organizzazione molto, dal punto di vista anche funzionalistico, senz'altro, perché è da lì che nasce poi l'interorganizational relations, l'interorganizational network, ma che ha visto nella, vorrei dire, benedizione tutta laica delle Nazioni Unite un collante fondamentale che non avevamo ancora potuto riscontrare in tante situazioni nazionali e internazionali dal punto di vista di quella che è la ricerca, che è sempre una sfida, una scommessa, è un qualche cosa che ci mette in gioco di volta in volta e alle quali non si arriva mai, per la quale non si arriva mai a una fine, ma si riapre sempre una nuova problematica. Quando c'è la questione dei minori, molti anni fa, all'inizio di questo secolo, di questo millennio, che purtroppo per tanti aspetti si presenta così tragico non solo per questa problematica, ci occupammo dei bambini soldato e in una trasmissione radiofonica alla quale partecipavo tutte le settimane, zapping dell'epoca, con l'allora conduttore, e noi arrivavamo a una conclusione che in effetti anche l'aver posto in qualche modo in essere ricerche con una narrazione dei bambini soldato dell'ultima guerra mondiale, e noi abbiamo il caso delle 4 giornate di Napoli, tanto che danno inizio e la stura a quella che è la guerra di resistenza contro il nazifascismo. Per cui non erano più possibili quei moduli narrativi e bisognava immaginare qualcos'altro. Cioè l'immaginazione sociologica doveva avere una fantasia che andasse oltre per poter in qualche modo anche occidentalizzare, se così si può dire, quelle categorie che erano basate su quella che era stata la realtà dell'ultima guerra mondiale in Europa e, cambiate le cose che vanno cambiate perché non hanno mai avuto la guerra in casa, in America. Allora, io avevo distinto 3 punti fondamentali, il primo, 3 punti che ritenevo importanti. Il primo, questa cassetta degli attrezzi che va rinnovata, parlo per noi che diamo l'apporto sociologico alla questione. La guerra, che non è più guerra mondiale, ma sono guerre locali, anche se possono essere guerre mondiali per procura, come la tragedia che stiamo vivendo da 9 mesi in Ucraina, e il network, cioè l'interorganizational relations, che diventa strumento vivo e vitale per la questione. Io ringrazio tantissimo tutti, in modo particolare appunto Silvia Scarpa qui presente, che ha voluto e che sostanzialmente giocherà anche il ruolo delle conclusioni che almeno sulla carta spettavano al sottoscritto, e soprattutto te colleghi Laura Guercio e Fausto Pocar, perché mi hanno ceduto il loro posto dandomi questa precedenza, e di questo non solo li ringrazio, ma chiedo anche scusa, umilmente scusa, ma purtroppo si cerca di incastrare tutte le cose. E il bello è, io veramente con grande ammirazione, perché voi riuscite a incastrare, parlo soprattutto a Fausto Pocar perché lo guardo veramente con una smisurata e incommensurabile stima e ammirazione, tante cose su una... Io non riesco a quadrare tutti i miei impegni sulla piazza di Roma. Vi dico tutto, ecco, tanto per dire le dimensioni diverse. Tanto questa giornata è sintomatica un po' della situazione. Bene, io veramente auguro buon proseguimento dei lavori, ringrazio tantissimo. Domani abbiamo un altro rendezvous che chiude questa 3 giorni al Parlamento, alla prestigiosa biblioteca del Senato in via del Seminario, a pochi passi da Piazza Navona, che è la sede del nostro istituto, del nostro glorioso istituto, nostro perché guardo Riccardo per l'appunto, guardo dottor Gugliotta, e auguro a tutti veramente buon proseguimento e buona serata. Grazie, grazie infinite.
Thank you very much, Professor De Nardis. It was such a great pleasure to have you here, and I'm sorry that you have to leave, and don't worry, I will conclude the event in your place. Let me translate briefly the speech of Professor De Nardis so that also those who don't understand Italian will have a chance to better understand the very interesting speech that Professor De Nardis just delivered. Professor De Nardis actually focused on 3 main issues. The first one is actually related to the lack of the right means for interpreting these new conflicts and for dealing with children in armed conflicts. Because actually we are used to think about this issue, we were used to think about this issue by looking at the world wars. And so when actually in the 1990s we saw the beginning of a variety of smaller, proxy wars or civil wars, especially also in the developing world, we needed actually to de-Westernize our point of view on conflicts and also on the children that are involved in these conflicts. He referred actually to the Second World War and to our case of the resistance in Italy and to the specific days in Naples, so events that actually affected Italian history and how children, and youth participated in the resistance during the Second World War against the Nazis. So definitely, that means that there has been a need to proceed actually with new tools for reinterpreting actually the new wars and the involvement of children in these new wars. And these are the 2 actually first and second interrelated issues. The third issue that Professor De Nardis raised is related actually to the important role of the universities network, also in the work of the Istituto San Pio V, the institute that he presides, that he is actually the president of. And in this respect, he discussed about the importance, especially in sociology, of interorganizational relations and of how actually the network contributed in terms of knowledge, in terms of research, in terms of the participation of many different scholars from different areas of the world, so that somehow we could reorganize these categories, as we said before, and also contribute to the discussion from multiple points of view and perspectives, as also Professor Drumbl mentioned before, in an interdisciplinary way on the issue of children in armed conflicts. Okay, sorry, but I thought it was important to translate also the speech of Professor De Nardis. Let me proceed by introducing Professor Fausto Pocar, who is a renowned Italian professor. Professor Pocar is Professor Emeritus of International Law, Private International Law, and European Law at the University of Milan. And together with Professor Guercio, he is the president, the co-president, and also with Giovanna Agnierre, who is present today with us, of the Universities Network for Children in Armed Conflicts. Professor Pocar was a judge between 2000 and 2017 of the International Criminal Tribunals for former Yugoslavia, and also the president thereof, and for Rwanda, where he also presided over the appeals chamber. From 2017 on, he has also been an ad hoc judge of the International Court of Justice. He has authored hundreds of publications in, obviously, these relevant fields of international law, international private law, and European law. So I found actually difficult to identify one or more. So definitely it's a great pleasure to have you here, Professor Pocar, and the floor is yours. Silvia. Great pleasure.
Mr. Rector, it's a great pleasure to be here for the first time in this well-known university and to address one with a few considerations, only a few comments, an issue which is extremely important. Let me perhaps start from one point, well, 2 points. One that's been mentioned by previous speakers is the armed conflict, the notion of armed conflict. It's true when one speaks of children in armed conflict, affected by armed conflict, when do you have really an armed conflict and what is the impact of an armed conflict on children? I will not have the pretension now to go in depth on this issue, because I'm sure that Mrs. Gamba will go back to that. If one looks at the mandate of Mrs. Gamba, one may have the impression that it's very limited in this respect. But in fact, it is not. And if one looks at her reports in particular, one sees the multitude, the variety of aspects that come into consideration. There is on one side, there is the direct participation of a child in armed conflict. There is the participation as soldiers, the fact that children are objects of violence. There are many issues that come into consideration. But the point is that there are a number of secondary effects of an armed conflict. And when one looks at these effects, they may be effects similar to a number of other violations that are not on armed conflict, which makes the mandate extremely ample, extremely wide, and difficult to deal with and to restrict to the armed conflict. And I see her difficulty in this because sometimes, I guess, when in New York, delegation will say, well, don't go too much beyond, because we wanted a narrower mandate. And why one does not want to go beyond? There is one reason that Mark has mentioned, and is the fact that all starts with human rights. And it's, you know, in 1989, a convention on the protection of children, the Child Convention, was adopted. There was none before. Human rights instruments mentioned children, but didn't go into details, and essentially mentioned children as the object of protection, an object of protection. But you know well that human rights is a matter not of being object of protection, but being subject of human rights, being holders of human rights. And the convention, in a way, was a Copernican revolution, because tried to repeat a range of human rights seen from the point of view of a child. So it's not, clearly the society has the obligation to protect children, but the child is a subject, a holder of rights. The obligation to protect exists, but it is the obligation essentially to recognize that children are holders of rights. And when you come to armed conflicts, again, most of commentators forget that and say the child is an object of protection. That's not true. It shouldn't be so. So the culture of human rights is extremely important to repeat and to be recognized in the fields also of. And I can't go, of course, here to discuss all the rights that are for in the 89 Convention from the point of view of the children. It will be too long to discuss this issue. But there are at least a couple of issues that have to be said. One starts from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 48. What is the declaration about? How does the declaration start? With the dignity of human beings. That's the main point. And one has to see that a child, as a human being, has a dignity. So has to be recognized as holder of that dignity, which means that even if the child is more vulnerable than adults, he must be recognized that he has rights, and this vulnerability should be abandoned or remedied, I would say, by recognizing the rights of these children. And coming to armed conflict, which is the main right that is violated. There are many, of course, physical violence, whatever, but the main right is stopping or putting obstacles to the future of the child. And where is the right, the main right for a child that when looking at his or her future? Education. Because the culture of human rights means that persons must know their rights and be sufficiently educated to protect their rights, to use and protect their rights. And education is all about that. We are here in a university, so I'm not saying something very, very new for anybody of you. I mean, why do you study? For your future. Not studying just to study. You have in mind that studying you will get a certain future. And so this is the point in the children. And the war is the main obstacle to education. Whether a child participates in the war, whether it's violence, whether the schools are destroyed, whatever, the child does not have a future. There is during the war, there is a break, a gap, that not necessarily you can make up a remedy afterwards. Maybe too long. Maybe the experiences of the war will not allow for that later on. So what is extremely important, and that's perhaps the reason of the universities network, is the education. And it's very important that we understand that. So I don't want to go much beyond this. I would have to say other things. But these are reflections that I went on considering through many of my experiences, because my experience in the human rights field is at least a bit more than 40 years, and started in the 80s when in the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations, I was asked to draft the general comment on the article concerning children. At the same time, I participated to all the work for the convention, of course. And in a way, worked on in that field. And then when I came to the tribunal of the former Yugoslavia, that was a bit of a shock, because my first case concerned children, former children, because the violations were committed against children, but were tried 10 years later, when these children came to give testimony of what they had suffered. And it was a case of mass rapes of girls that were 12, 13, 14. When they came to give testimony, they were 10, 12 years older. So they gave testimony as adults, but the experience was an experience, and what they told us as judges was really shocking, actually. And I don't go beyond, I don't want to give my experience, but I will conclude on the education, remembering a sentence, a dictum of a children activist that was a Pakistani girl, young girl, the youngest winner of a Nobel Prize in 2014. And then speaking of Malala Yousafzai, she said, one child, give me one child, one teacher, one book, and one pen. With this, we can change the world. That means change the future also for children. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Pocar, for having emphasized the important role of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and in particular the right to education, as well as the concept of dignity that, as you say, was included in the Universal Declaration. Then perhaps it was forgotten for many years, and then it reappeared in 2000 in the European Union Charter of Fundamental Rights. And so I agree with you that that fundamental right, which somehow enshrines the whole of the rights, should be mentioned more often. Last but not least, my colleague, good friend, Laura Guercio, really sorry that we had to change the order. Laura Guercio is probably the soul of the university's network in children in armed conflict. She is a practicing lawyer, professor at the University of Perugia, and co-president of the university's network in children in armed conflicts. So she recently published a couple of books that are important and that I would like to mention: Discrimination Against Women, New Social Device and Hopes, with Licosia in 2020, and with Professor Paul Blocker, Sociology for Human Rights in Italian, for Mondadori. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Silvia. I will say just a few words because I'm a speaker, but I'm an organizer also with Silvia, and I know that the time is very strict now, so I will be very fast. Please let me know, thanks all the students online, and especially students coming from universities in Congo and Iraq, because I know that it's very difficult to be in touch online with us for electricity problems. So this is an hybrid meeting. So here you are just a few, but there are other students online. I won't say anything about the mandate, your mandate at Mrs. Gamba, because you already told us everything, and my previous colleagues already said everything, so I don't want to repeat some topics that have been underlined and that I consider very important. But I would like just to say one thing. Yes, education is very important, and that's that's the reason of the University's Network for Children Armed Conflict. But we realized after 2 days together in Luxembourg, then there is another important aspect, that is the right human touch, human approach to issues like children, like the problems, the issues of the violence against children armed conflict. And I think that, if I can say, Mrs. Gamba, you gave us this lesson during these last days, and probably also now, surely now, because you could reach the heart of students and people during the meeting we had in Luxembourg, talking, of course, about your mandate with your deep expertise and your high-level profile, but also with your heart. So I think that it's very important, this lesson you gave us. And I think that, of course, it's very important to learn law, medicine, psychology, sociology, every scientific field. We are in a university, so you are studying a lot of very important scientific field in order to become lawyer, to become professionals in different camp, in different field. But at the same time, it's nothing. This is nothing if you don't have human touch when you have to cover, to work and to cover your profile as a lawyer, as a doctor, as a judge. You must have human touch. And that's very important because if you want to destroy all the barriers, all the obstacles that you can face in your life, you need to have the right competence, but also to feel, to understand who are the person you have in front of you, and how you can reach them, especially when you talk with children, when you work with children, and when you talk about children, especially children armed conflict. So what we learned during this meeting, but also during the last meetings in Luxembourg, is that we have straightened education through our universities network, but also straighten all our efforts in order to face and to destroy barriers. We are in a university. Of course, the university is not only the building where you study. University is from universitas, Latin, that means the whole world. So we know very well that also universities are in competitions among them because we need funds, we need to be the best. So it's very frequent that we are in competition among us, among professors and universities. But we have to give to the students the importance to understand how they must cooperate together. And for this reason, the Universities Network has among its aim to create bridges among universities and among students. And we want to do this. We want to go on any kind of competitions. We want to work together. We want to put students in touch among them. So for this reason, we created a lot of groups of research, because research is one of the most important aspects that we have to work on. Research studies, but research is also with students, because you are actors, not future actors. You are current actors. You have to change the world now, and you must work as agent of changes. So we, professor, we have the duty to support you and to work with you for creating all the possible network in order to realize a dream that is not a dream, that is to respect human rights, and especially for our network, children rights in armed conflict. So this is a very brief and a short speech, because I leave the floor immediately to...
Thank you very much. Professor Guercio, the issue that you emphasized is actually very important. Participation, youth participation, but also young adults participation. Many of the students here are young adults, but definitely their participation is important, because the world that we want to build for tomorrow is their world, first of all. So definitely that is very important. We have a few minutes for questions and answers. So let's proceed and open the floor for questions.
Yeah, there is a question.
Yes. Wait a minute for the microphone. Thanks.
Does it work?
Yes.
So I was wondering, what do you think can be done in the realm of international law to help and improve the situation of these children in practical terms?
Thank you very much. Who would like to answer to this question? Who is the expert? Professor Pocar, Professor Drumbl.
Well, I'm happy to.
Professor Drumbl first, okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so I think my biggest piece of advice for what international law can do in this particular space would be two different emotions. The first emotion, I would say, is modesty. In other words, I think law can do a lot, but it can never think that it can do it all. And the second emotion that I would suggest is curiosity. Namely, at the local level, in all of the hotspots the special representative mentioned, international law has its fascination with universals. But these universals need to be integrated into local life, the way life is lived locally. And those customs, practices, habits, realities, cultural understandings, it's absolutely key to harmonize the two. And I think this is one area where the Convention on the Rights of the Child, I think, sometimes falls a bit short, however crucial it is. Namely, by setting very firm universals, I think sometimes it loses the ease, the flexibility, the maturity, and the ability to integrate into local spaces. So I think instead of proposing a very concrete differentiation, I think what would be very helpful is the emotions of a bit of modesty and then curiosity, how these children actually live their lives. And I really, really love, just to close, what Laura said with regards to the touch. International law needs to touch as opposed to talk down at.
Thank you very much. Professor Pocar?
I don't have anything to add to this.
Laura.
To add to this, except that perhaps one of the, on the same line, I mean, one of the main issues is to be able to look at the life in terms that are legal in a way, in terms maybe, I use this word, of accountability. Because when you examine a situation in law, you have to, maybe it's my deformation as a judge, you have to see who is accountable. And on these matters, you come to the conclusion that everybody is accountable. That nobody is not, can say, I'm not the person that's accountable. Because you have to take action. And you can't just pass by and not look at what and how in international law. It's part of the technique of international law because the sources, the main source of international law is customary law. And customary law is an interpretation of the reality, essentially, not more than that. It's a building, looking at what happens and see the rights and obligations, so accountability at the end. The word accountability, which is difficult to translate from English to Italian. There is no real equivalent, exact equivalent. I mean, once a French professor, we were speaking of accountability, he said, well, what's that about? There is no French translation of that word, so it's a non-concept. Because for the French, it's a non-concept. But, I mean, we know what accountability is, actually. And the world would be better with more accountability.
Thank you very much.
If I may, we have talked about individual accountability also in Luxembourg. Yeah. Yes, so on this aspect, I would like to give the floor to you, Mrs. Gamba, because individual responsibility is very important. Everyone can do the difference, can make the difference.
Thank you. She doesn't know that when I talk, usually I forgot what I said, but it doesn't really matter.
But we remember.
Yes, and I'm
Be
going
careful,
to.
because we remember.
I'm going to jump on the opportunity. First of all, I really want to thank very much Mark, Paolo, Fausto, Laura. Everything that was said, I agree 100%. And I felt, how can I tell you, for the first time in a long time, I feel less alone, because it's like a confirmation that I'm not really crazy, that others that also think and come from different disciplines than me point in the same direction. So I think this is one of the things why, for me, the university is so important, really, because this multidimensional, interdisciplinary possibility that the university does to debate a topic. You put the topic in the middle of the table and you analyze it from many different points of view, and you saw the wheat of the chaff. What is the basic? What is the most important? So I think for me, today, you have vindicated me. And I tell you, it's been hard, because I've been criticized very much, sometimes from escaping my mandate, sometimes from pushing the envelope, and I've always answered in the ways that you had explained. It belongs here. If you tell me none of these issues belong on the children and conflict agenda, and therefore I am not doing that. But every aspect that you have discussed today and that you have mentioned as a way forward belong in the discussion of children in armed conflict and how to stop it, because ultimately, who cares about children in armed conflict? We want to stop it. The only reason that it's there is because everybody's trying to find a solution. So it's very stupid to discuss cancer without discussing why are we discussing it, because we need to understand it so we can diagnose it, so we can cure it. But to just talk for the sake of talking about how horrible it is to use children in war, it's for me a loss of time. So you wanted me to talk about accountability. I made a lot of notes. I'm taking everything as very good ideas or to vindicate me when I need help in defending what I'm trying to do. But I think the best way to try to summarize the issue of accountability has to do with, in one way or the other, all of you have given the same advice. Don't be an observer. You're not an observer of life. You are not at the mercy of life. You are in control of your life. And I think this issue of knowing yourself, which from Socrates onwards is possibly the only big, real thing that we have to take into account the minute we know how to think, is clearly the most important aspect. You talk about accountability. Accountability is not a word. Like violations is not a word. Like human rights are not words. Sometimes we denigrate an issue by giving it a word. In antiquity, words were magical. They were not bandied about, you know. A word meant something, and many times a word opened doors to something. Sometimes there were words that opened doors to other dimensions, other words, mysticism. They opened a connection between you and perhaps other entities. Words were not bandied in vain. And we have become a culture where we use words and we forgot what words are for. So we are not using words as the tools that we need to use. We've forgotten the meaning of words. So how to be accountable? First of all, know yourself. It's really easy. You don't need a rocket science degree to know yourself. You just need to look inside and understand what makes you click. Every one of us knows what they hate and what they love. Every one of us knows what is right and what is wrong in one's own system of belief. So, in effect, you have to be true to yourself. When you cheat yourself, you cry. You go out of the room and you say, I wish I hadn't said that to my friend. You know, I wish I hadn't been selfish. I wish I had not envied. I wish I had not lied to my mother. I wish I had actually done the homework and not said something else. You know that what you did is wrong. So don't mistrust your instincts. And this is the basis of accountability. And then you have to understand, once you know yourself, and you make a little list of what is right and wrong for you, because there is no universal method of knowing what is right and wrong. What is right for you might be wrong for somebody else, you know, that's the issue. It's only you. Your universe is you. So to start with the individual, you have to start with accountability by the individual. Once you decide what is right and wrong for you, you have to sustain that. You cannot be a flan or a pancake. You cannot change your principles just because you want to please someone else. You have to stop worrying about what others think of you. You have to stop worrying about seeing you through the eyes of others. Reality is what it is. You know, see the world as it is, not as you wish it to see. And have the courage to see you, not as you wish others would see you, but as you really are. And then that will really make you accountable to yourself. There's only one person you need to be your best friend, you. If you are not your best friend, you will be lonely all your life. So if you're going to engage in law, in international law, in justice, it's very important that you are accountable to yourself. So I think these issues, even the questions that we've heard about how can we make international law, how can we do something, this is a very interesting question. Because there are a number of issues within the law, I am not a lawyer, that using your imagination, you might find gaps. Even one word might change the meaning of something that already exists in writing. So yes, you can improve the existing tenets, obligations, protocols, articles within international law. But they're not going to be the answer on the application of that. And it is the application of the law that is important. So I'll give you one simple example. Everything is very complex, everything is multidimensional, everything is interdisciplinary. And you must learn how to tie the dots in order to achieve a result. I'm a strategist, I am not a lawyer, so I know nothing of children. I got absolutely nothing about medicine, I know nothing of that, but I know about war. And the dynamics of conflict are very important to understand. Everyone talked about the evolution and dynamics of conflict. War has changed, violence has changed. The imagination to conduct violence for different means is there forever. It will continue changing. We haven't seen the end of it yet. There are many iterations. So how do you control the evolution of the use of violence, the evolution of the use of armed coercion or violence as a tool to do something, to achieve something? I said in Luxembourg that ultimately war is nothing more than the ability to break things and kill people. And if you forget that, no matter how fancy language you put around it to distance yourself emotionally from what is happening, it won't work. So you have to turn it, flip it around. What is law? What is international law? Why do you study it? Why do we have it? Why did we go through thousands of years to generate codes of conduct and norms? What was the object of that? So in strategy, we always say, and I go back to what Mark answered you, really, strategy is the practical adaptation of existing means to comply and obtain the object of policy. If you don't know the policy, if you don't know what you need to reach, then it's immaterial because the strategy is only a road to reach an object. If you forget your object and you put the cart before the horse, you only look at your method, your technology, your information, without knowing how to put it to the service of an object, then you're not doing human rights for sure, and you're not protecting children for sure, and the children will never be subject of protection for sure, because we've forgotten. That's what Fausto says, and he's right. You know, just the issue of object-subject changes everything, and it changes the ability to do that strategy. So I always say, if you really want to transform the world, it is not a decision. It is an action. And because you don't control the world, and you don't control your nation, and you don't control this class, and you don't control this curricula, no one controls anything, control doesn't exist outside of yourself. You're the only ones that can control you. So take a decision. How are you going to implement what you want to see? If you have your object clear, you want to better protect children, right? You want to make sure that the children will be and receive the rights that belong to them. And you can do it in a multitude of ways. In every action that you take, in every decision that you take, it can be done. So I'm always astonished. I will finish with one anecdote. She liked my anecdotes. But in one anecdote, and you're right, Mark, reintegration is the single most important strategic issue. It's a game changer, and no one sees it. The reason they don't see it is because of money, right? So it's another story. That's economics. So this has to do with the reintegration center for girls that had been raped and had babies, and their communities refused to have them back. So UNICEF started, and the NGOs started to give them some means to survive without causing trouble. And the means to survive without causing trouble was to teach them how to become bakers, so that they could do something and sell something. And when I went to visit these girls, they gave me a bread that they had made as a present in a remote area, in a remote country of Africa. And I said, what do you need from me? You know, I mean, I could really make some things happen. Do you need clothes? Do you want me to trace your family? What do you need from me? And this girl, not yet 16, she told me, I want someone to buy my bread. Simple, concrete, very practical. I was so angry, I cannot begin to tell you. It is my Italian blood. It's very far back, but it is still there. So I grabbed that piece of bread. I went on the helicopter. I knew that my next visit was with the president of that republic. And I went to see him because I had an appointment. When I got to the president's office, they didn't allow me to move my bread through because it had to go through a security scan in case it had a bomb and I meant to kill him. I said, it's bread, I need the bread back, so you cannot remove it from me, put it through the security scan. Went through the security scan, I said, give me back my bread. They couldn't understand me. So when I took the bread into the meeting, I said, I brought you a gift. I brought you this bread. And the man looked at me and said, you know, I'm the special representative, I'm the highest UN person in that country forever. So he doesn't know what to do. He has to accept it. I said, no, but I'm not sending it to you. This is a gift from your children, the children that this war has destroyed. These children are making this for you. Oh, well, thank you very much. No, I said, I've gone yesterday to the supermarket in the corner. That supermarket in the corner is owned by the private sector of your country. It's not German or French. No, it's owned by some of your people. I know that because I do my homework. The bread sold in your supermarkets is coming by plane from the neighboring state. You have perfectly good bread here that is produced by the children that are a result of your wars. Minimally, if you're going to sell bread to the people, have 10% of all the bread that is sold in that supermarket by law and decree must be bought from reintegration centers of children recovery. You have the money. You have the possibility. Why am I saying this? The dots. Link the dots. The solutions are all there. But what is the point if a peace-building UN agency or a good willing donor of the West goes to one of these countries and builds up a new supermarket and they ignore completely the local needs, when it would be so easy to just say, okay, 10% in any post-conflict reconstruction will be prioritized. I made boys that knew how to make wells. I made other boys, child soldiers, they had been taught how to make nails. No, the nails were being flown from Europe to reconstruct buildings. Tie the dots. It's not the human touch, it's the smart touch. We have no money, there's no time, there's no coordination, and there's no thinking in a multidimensional way. So how can we improve international law? If you go to an armed group and you say you must improve international law, I'll teach you what it is. It's paper. It's paper. You have to show it on the ground. So.
Thank you very much to all of you for your interesting and important answers. You have all emphasized the important elements, and Ms. Gamba definitely has given this human touch that also Professor Guercio was mentioning before in terms of putting into practice also legal standards, because otherwise they might look very distant, and even if some of us, Professor Pocar demonstrated that they can shape, they can contribute to the creation of standards and to the development of new standards, but then if they are not taken to the lowest level at the national level, then this is not going to be effective. Only a couple of few words. In the report that your office, Mrs. Gamba, published on the 25th anniversary, 3 words were identified, and I would like to use them for concluding this presentation and this wonderful event. Cooperation, commitment, and perseverance. I think that we have emphasized the many ways through which, through partnerships, through the involvement of universities, of students, through work that still needs to be done in terms of accountability, tribunals. I saw Mrs. Massidda from the office of the Public Counsel of the International Criminal Court that joined us. So the role of judicial institutions, but also the role of political institutions, as you correctly said. They all need to work together and to somehow have perseverance in what we do. Let me conclude with a quote from John Fitzgerald Kennedy. He said once that children are the worst, more valuable resource, and it's best hope for the future. So let's hope that all together we can continue to contribute to finding solutions for the issue and the plight of children in armed conflicts. Thank you very much. Round of applause to all of you.
Not to criticize your office. Okay.
That's good.
So I would like to thank also people online because
Yes.
you.
Okay. They are leaving, but let's
now,
thank also
because
all
for the
of them
timing,
who were
yes.
online. Yes, we ran out of time. Okay.